tzedakah, tzedek, and gimilut hasadim, charity, justice, and acts of loving kindness, all part of the Jewish tapestry. In the earliest days of settlement in St. Paul, soon after synagogues were established, early charitable efforts focused mainly on one basic, necessary act: assisting at the time of loss of a family member. The community would ensure proper rituals and dignity for a Jewish burial, regardless of the financial status of the family, for those in need, often taking up a collection graveside. It would be nearly 15 years after the first Jews arrived in St. Paul that there would be a formal, organized social welfare effort. The Mount Zion Hebrew Ladies Benevolent Society was formed in 1871. In the minutes of some of the early meetings, it can be seen that the women got down to the very practical business of helping new arrivals with their most basic needs. Coal was delivered, a doctor bill paid, a sewing machine purchased, and train fares secured for those needing to travel on to other cities. The men had established their own organizations, focusing their support on struggling Jewish farming communities in Painted Woods and Devil's Lake, North Dakota. By the late 1880s, the number of arriving Eastern European Jews in the St. Paul community was greatly increasing. The established German Jewish community felt an obligation to help the new arrivals assimilate as best they could, while a social and physical distance between them remained. In 1893, sewing classes for young Jewish immigrant women were started to help prepare them for work as seamstresses. These classes were also helpful in learning American customs. The sewing classes expanded and became the Industrial School for Girls on Fairfield Avenue in 1895. Under the guidance of Sophie Worth, then vice president of the Hebrew Ladies Benevolent Society, and Mount Zion's Rabbi Ripens, these classes found a home at 153 Robertson Street, and by then had come to be known as simply Neighborhood House. Neighborhood House quickly grew, and its impact on the lives of the growing immigrant community was no longer exclusive to Jews, but opened its doors to the Irish and Norwegian immigrants on the West Side as well. In 1893, upon her return from the Congress of Religions in Chicago, Nina Moraes Cohen was inspired by a meeting with Hannah Solomon, president of the National Council of Jewish Women. Nina Cohen, wife of prominent Minneapolis attorney Emanuel Cohen, and a powerful organizing force herself, decided there needed a similar effort in Minneapolis. In July of 1894, the Minneapolis section of the National Council of Jewish Women was established, with a St. Paul section following shortly after. It would set out to improve the lives of women and children at a time when there were very few social support mechanisms for a growing population of poor that this new industrialized century of American life was producing. Nina Cohen was also active in the women's suffrage movement. In 1901, when the National Suffrage Convention met in Minneapolis, Susan B. Anthony was a guest in her home. When Nina Cohen died in 1918, the Minneapolis Journal wrote, "Perhaps our city has had no one woman whose quiet influence upon the spiritual and intellectual life of the community has gone out more widely and more forcefully than has that of Mrs. Cohen." While just a teenager when Nina Cohen and Susan B. Anthony were convening, Fanny Fligelman Bren would become another tireless proponent of women's suffrage, working closely with and modeling her efforts after Nina Cohen, and then becoming NCJW section president in 1924.
They changed this energy to invest now. What do we do to train women, to teach women, to guide women? Now that we have the vote, and the National Council for Jewish women became thinking about how do you educate? What's proper welfare? How do we get women to understand these are absolute subjects we have to work for?
Fanny Brin went on to become national president of the National Council of Jewish Women in 1932 and remained a tireless advocate for peace throughout her life. Programs and institutions that were born from NCJW were fixtures in the early 1900s. Council Camp opened in 1914 for poor mothers and children. Jewish Day Nursery to take care of the children while their mothers trained. And in the coming decades, many other programs and institutions were implemented by NCJW, all designed to improve the lives of women and children. In the early 1960s, the St. Paul section began their fight against poverty and to assist disadvantaged youth who were being left behind in basic elementary education. What earned the name Miracle at McKinley would be the beginning of the Head Start program. The Talmud Torah, and then Emmanuel Cohen Center, became Minneapolis's North Side answer to providing a variety of social services, learning, and recreational opportunities. And from there emerged today's JCCs. As the wave of immigration began to slow in the early 1900s, the focus shifted from simply integrating new arrivals into American society to helping them improve their everyday lives. The Associated Jewish Charities was established in 1910. It was formed to help bring together the efforts of several local charities. In the early 1920s, they changed their name to the Jewish Family Welfare Association, the predecessor of today's Jewish Family and Children's Services, JFCS. As the influenza pandemic of 1918 resulted in a wave of orphans and children whose parents could not take care of them, a concern grew that these children in foster care would lose their Jewish culture and traditions. Rabbi and Mrs. Louis Seltzer of Sherei Zedek Synagogue initiated the effort to establish a home for these children. The Jewish Sheltering Home began in a 20-bedroom Victorian home on 10th Avenue. The need grew, and in 1934, a 3-story brick building was built across the street from the Emmanuel Cohen Center, and a few years later changed its name to the Oak Park Home. It would serve European refugee children awaiting adoption after World War II. Oak Park continued operation until social programs began to change and favor children living in foster homes rather than larger institutions. Oak Park closed its doors in 1964. The Minneapolis Federation of Jewish Service was established in 1930, combining several individual organizations. Focusing on helping people find work during the worsening conditions of both the Great Depression and the resulting increase in anti-Semitism, the Jewish Free Employment Bureau became the Jewish Employment Service in 1936. At the same time, the Minnesota Jewish Council was formed, and their decades of fighting anti-Semitism began as the predecessor of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, today's JCRC. The Associated Jewish Charities of St. Paul was formed by 4 different women's charities that came together in 1910, later to become the Jewish Family Service of St. Paul, which continues to this day to serve members of the community of all races, religions, national origins, and ethnic backgrounds. With its beginnings as a national organization in 1912, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, or Hadassah, formed a chapter in Minneapolis in 1924. In the following years, St. Paul, Duluth, Aberdeen, Hibbing, Sioux Falls, Fargo, and Bismarck all followed by forming their own chapters. Duluth's Hadassah chapter did their part to help win the war, as a P-51 Mustang was put into service as a result of raising $80,000 in war bonds, raising money for hospitals, advocating and building political relationships, and ensuring the health and well-being of those in Palestine who were building the Jewish state. Hadassah's work supporting health care, women's equality, and a strong U.S.-Israeli relationship continues to this day. As the generation of immigrants entered old age, the Orthodox community's Sisters of Peace Benevolent Society established the Jewish Home for the Aged in 1907. The house on Wilkins Street in St. Paul left much to be desired, as it was condemned by the fire marshal in 1916. Minneapolis and St. Paul came together to establish a new facility in 1923 on Midway Parkway and Snelling Avenue. After years of their own fundraising, the Daughters of Abraham established the Shalom Residence at a home on South St. Albans Street in St. Paul in 1947. In the years that followed, both facilities faced many challenges of meeting the needs of the community's elderly. But medical care improved, and social and quality of life programs developed. And finally, in 1971, they merged to become Shalom Home. From the very first Jewish settlers in St. Paul, the Jewish community continues to educate their youth, give relief to those in need, and help change our society for the better through peaceful and organized efforts in an ever-changing social and political landscape. The needs may have changed, but the actions and determination to meet those needs, to care for those in our community, and to repair the world remain. And it happened right here.